and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Tonight at midnight marks the culmination of 14 days of official campaigning across 6 states that are going to the polls, and on the eve of Election Day, we bring you a comprehensive wrap-up on this special 1-hour episode of Consider This, guided by the analysis of our political commentator, Dr. Bridget Welsh, who is an Honorary Research Associate at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia's Asia Research Institute. Now, Bridget is a keen observer of Malaysian politics, and throughout this campaign season has been spending considerable time on the ground in each of the 6 states. She's been seeking out where the competitive seats are, where the battlegrounds are at the highest, where the stakes are highest for each battleground. Now, she has diligently published a podcast episode every day of the last 14 days of this campaign period, and you can find all the episodes of Bridget's Kerusi Panas, which is made in collaboration with Malaysia Kini and Renegade Radio. I highly recommend them, and we welcome Bridget Welsh to the show. Hello, Bridget. How are you today?
Great, Melissa. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being on in the studio with us after being on the road for so many weeks now. I really want to get a sense of where you are at with the observing this campaign. The past, let's just with the last 14 days of official campaigning, where do you think campaign is at? What is your gauge of the mood and the sentiment on the ground?
You know, what's going on in Malaysia is that elections are becoming more normal. And when they become more normal, there kind of isn't that same level of kind of intensity that we found around general elections. And these kind of mega state polls fit between kind of a state election and kind of a national election. That said, there is pretty much sentiments that are growing on the ground for Pakatan Nasional, particularly in the Malay heartland states of Kedah, Kelantan, and Terengganu. And I'm expecting that they will also make gains in the other states that are up for grabs, such as Selangor, Negeri Sembilan, and Penang. But I think we also see, you know, with this gains, it's this part of this process of normalization, right? Opposition gains tractions when there's discontent, right? And so we see that going on the ground. And while there is some mobilization of ethnic sentiments, and I think these are real, and the ethnic voting patterns and ethnic polarization are still very pertinent, I would also say that, you know, voters are just looking at these different options, they're considering them, and they're thinking, hey, I will send a message, or I will give a different option, and because that's what happens in the democratic process. People choose the different alternatives, and then they will choose other ones when the next option comes.
Okay, so when you say kind of normalization of the opposition gaining ground, I wanted to talk to you about the way these state elections have been framed, by and large being framed as a referendum on Anwar Ibrahim's leadership the past 8 months or so, a referendum on the unity government, federal government. What do you make of that, Bridget?
Well, I think, you know, the opposition Pakatan Nasional made that the way they framed the election. And what happened is Anwar Ibrahim's government embraced that. So as a consequence, what happens is that we don't necessarily and haven't seen the discussions about state leadership, state policies to the same degree that we might in another type of state election. So at a certain level, this is the federal narrative, right? Behind that, not just about personalities, but the main issue across the board is the economy. Fundamentally.
Did you think that was a mistake, that because it was framed by Perikatan Nasional as a referendum on the federal government, and the fact that, you know, Pakatan Harapan and Barisan Nasional rose to that, actually decided to pick up on that same framing and repeat that narrative, was that a mistake?
I think it was. Okay. I think it's a mistake on 3 different levels. Number one, Pakatan Nasional is basically couching implicitly this campaign as a battle of the federal government, which it isn't. All right, and so they're promising their supporters that this is a way to change the federal government, when state elections aren't that. Right? And so implicitly comes out of that this discussion of potential instability that comes as a result of that. Second issue is that Anwar's popularity is varied among the different states, and we've seen this in Ilham Center surveys and other surveys that have come across nationally. We see popularity that's higher in Selangor and Penang than it is in other places. And so when you make a campaign about an individual that has varied popularity, this also puts that individual at risk. And the third thing is that ultimately the decision is going to be about who governs states. So when you don't talk about what's happening at state levels, then in fact there isn't enough attention to those sets of issues. Now, some campaigns have evolved, and I think in the last week of the campaign we've seen that. And ultimately we will also see the results. The results vary by state because of the state dynamics being so central in shaping the outcome.
Okay, I'm hoping that we will have some time to get into the unique dynamics in each of the states. But can I pull on some of the threads that you laid out for us? The potential instability threat. Let's talk about that. Perikatan Nasional indicating that, well, actually, if there is a major victory on their side, that this might lead to a change in federal government, that this may sway GPS to maybe switch allegiances. Is there any merit of truth in that?
So the sources of instability are twofold. Number one, is it about changing the coalition partners, right? So, and making the changing alliance of the coalition partners within the unity government. My own view is that this is something that is very speculative and part of the propaganda that Perikatan Nasional is using in the campaign. I think that one has to see the results and have to see the outcome, and also recognize that the relationship between Sabah Sarawak partners and even within the unity government still has a very strong bind, even if they do badly, which I think in some ways they won't in some places. Second of all, no question, the different performance of different parties in the coalition will create strain. And I think in particular I draw attention to how UMNO might perform in the election. And I think there will be some significant soul searching that will have to be done in that process. But these issues of instability, I think, have been overplayed from the perspective of Perikatan Nasional about over-promising that they can change the federal government. And I think they have been, intentionally misleading the electorate from the perspective of the way that they've been engaging on the ground. But that's how they mobilize, right? Because they've made this a referendum in that regard.
Do you think that might play to their advantage? I'm just wondering, would voters be swayed by the prospect of more instability, of more government change?
I think their base and many voters do have a concern about wanting to change the federal government, right? And it's not about Anwar Ibrahim. It's also there's impatience with the electorate of wanting results, and the economic situations of the ground are very challenging. And so when you speak to people in Velde areas or even in parts of urban areas, there's a perception among some voters that this is about the federal government. There isn't the same recognition that this is the state level. But at the same time, there's many people who understand this is just at the state level. Okay. So, there's kind of these variations among the voters.
Okay, so at the state level, what are the issues that should have been the primary focus, as opposed to this being framed as a federal government referendum? Because state governments impact the everyday lives of Malaysians in a way that maybe federal government doesn't, right? What are the issues you think should be pertinent?
Well, some state issues have been on the table. So in Kedah, the relationship between the state government and the federal government has been very pertinent. And Sanusi has used state nationalism very, very systematically, and I think he will gain support because of that. My own view also is that the other issues, such as the quality of the state leadership, the policies they put in place in terms of social welfare, how they responded to issues during the COVID period, during floods, the questions of land management, besides the issue of the federal government, are all things that are directly under state jurisdiction. And we can see in places like Terengganu, the government has been seen to perform very well. And so they talk about housing distribution, the different programs. So as a result, we see that the support for the state government is strong compared to that, for example, in other places in the country.
Do you think it's because we have, as voters, been so used to having state governments at the state elections at the same time as general elections that almost always the federal level issues, national policy eclipses or overwhelms the narrative, the discussion, that we haven't actually trained ourselves as voters to be thinking about, well, how has the state government performed, and then judging them and voting accordingly.
Well, in Sarawak, and to a certain degree in Sabah, we've had state elections. So in this regard, we do have focal points on the state government's performance. I think it is changing. And this is where I go back to the original point that I raised. It's a normalization. This is an expanding of democratic space. So, you know, lots of things have happened in this campaign that have been very positive. So the Anwar government has, for example, had a whole series of programs and policy announcements during this campaign. Nothing from like public pressure to push the issues of policies, right? The economic Madani program and others have come out, right? And that's quite normal. I think it might have served the government better if those came out a little bit earlier, but the fact that they've come out has actually been an indication of that, to show some of the efforts that they have been doing in government, which I think cannot be underestimated. At the same time, we've also seen a whole, you know, a discussion about certain policies, political debates, about economic models. We've seen discussions at the state level about issues of water. So there is kind of substantive issues that are being discussed. Unfortunately, the campaigns don't necessarily channel those directly to how they mobilize the voters. So there still is this sense of wanting to mobilize about kind of very more simplistic messages of change the government, or about issues of race or religion. And so here is where there's the disconnect between the political parties and the voters. But I think that, you know, Malaysians have access to so much more information that they have before. And I think they shouldn't be underestimated in how they think about some of these particular areas. But what is, you know, the rational conversations about policies and issues are juxtaposed to a campaign that also mobilizes emotions. And this is where the uncertainty is in making predictions are, because the emotional sentiments and the personalized dimensions of these emotional sentiments are still quite real on the ground.
Okay, which is wonderful because you've spent time, I think you've made 2 laps now, Bridget, haven't you, during this campaign period for all the 6 states. Let's come back and talk a little bit about your observations of what it is that people are talking about and what they are concerned about. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to this special 1-hour episode of Consider This on the eve of polling day. I have with me political commentator, political analyst, Dr. Bridget Welsh. Let's talk a little bit about Kedah. Let's hone in on Kedah because I think quite an interesting place. It's changed state governments many times, so everyone's focused, honing in on Kedah as a key battleground state. What is your sense of how competitive this state really is?
So when I first started analyzing Kedah, and I made 4 trips to, you know, in that context, and you know, great engagement with Kedahans. They have great sense of humor, right? And what I would say is that that we see. Initially, the state was almost 60% of the seats were competitive, but increasingly as the campaign evolved, I think the incumbent government, the PAS government, has gained more ground. And so the 2 zones that were the most competitive were in the north around Alustar, right? And of course also in the south, in the southern parts, places around Sungai Petani, and seats in that particular area. Both of these areas are becoming more and more transformed, and PAS has made grounds. I think there are a couple reasons for that. PAS, I think, has been very calculating in how they have chosen their candidates. So they've put football players, social influencers, and this is, again, what we see in democratic systems. People put people who are popular into particular seats. And so that, and the campaign has transformed to be much more on TikTok and messaging. And Sanusi himself, the Menteri Besar, has so much influence in that area. I think also when he had that when he had faced those issues of his charges and arrests and others, particularly the timing of the arrest, this also created a sense of injustice among many Kerajans who felt like this is just not quite right in terms of that. So you have the personality of the Menteri Besar, the changing kind of strategic decisions of how they vote, how they place candidates that have worked to their advantage, as well as changing demographics. But let's take away from all of that stuff and then point to two other things that are very important. First of all, Kerajans don't want another change of government.
Okay.
All right, you know, they've had three. And I think, you know, if things aren't broken, they'll stick with it. And I think the phrase that I remember very succinctly from one of the voters was, you know, I'm not yet tired of this government.
Oh.
And, you know, and it captured this, right, in the sense that it wasn't necessarily that I love everything about this person or the way the government is working, but I'll stick with what I know because of the fact that they don't want that turbulence and that they're seen to be making some sets of gains. And Keda's economy has been growing, and I think that has something that is important to recognize. The second issue is that the opposition in Kedah has not regenerated. So UMNO, where it's trying to win its seats, and is particularly in the more interior places like Pedu or Kuala Ketel, where they've had seats that have been very dominant in the past, they haven't been able to have the same level of traction. So UMNO is facing this challenge nationally, an erosion of support. But it is also taking place in Kedah, in part because it doesn't have the same ground base that it used to before.
Okay, I want to ask you about, just focus on personalities first. The choice of candidates, you talked about picking popular people, so the personality shines. Is that, I mean, what does that speak to in terms of what voters expect in terms of skill sets or training or background for performance of their elected representatives, their assembly persons? I'm not saying that you can't be popular and have a good governance skill set, but how does that play out in terms of personality versus performance?
Well, I think one of the bigger challenges that Malaysia is facing, right, is that we have many candidates that are running for many parties that don't have the same level of competence. And here's this disconnect between is a much more demanding electorate expecting outcomes and policies and deliverables with candidates that don't have the skill sets to be able to even understand some of the policy debates. And that's the disconnect, right? And for some political parties, they focus on saying it's part of us, it's our community, right? So therefore it doesn't matter how they perform. But for others, that there's a sense the performance must be very important, and that they demonize these other candidates that are seen as weak. And so this is part of the polarization. We think about the polarization as being an ethnic polarization, but the polarization is also about the way that they conceptualize their leaders and the standards that they have for their leaders.
One of the things that I thought was particularly interesting about Kedah and about Sanusi as a bigger, larger than life personality in these state elections is his use of state nationalism, or this invoking of Kedah first, similar to like Sarawak first, right? The Borneo bloc does that very well. How do we think about this sense of unfairness, this almost resentment towards the federal government for what it perceives to be as unfair opportunity, allocation and resources or opportunities to Kedah, and how Sanusi, as MB, incumbent MB, uses it to his advantage?
So the phrase that they use is the greater Kedah. And
it's very Donald Trump, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, let's be real. The Kerajaan Nasional is making political gains because they're much more strategic in how they're going about using their campaign strategies. And this issue of state nationalism it's pertinent, and Kerajans feel neglected. And they know when they go from the resources are a problem for Kedah. You know, water supply is a big issue. By the way, it also matters because the state government is also involved in water. But the fact is that it taps into something people know and are aware of in that context. So discontent takes very different forms. But I would also say that what's happened in this conversation is that Sanusi is kind of a rare phenomenon in Malaysian politics. We've had the history of kind of charismatic politicians. And what happens to charismatic politicians is they're usually they're pushed out of their political parties. So this happened at UMNO as well, right? So Sanusi is he's a force, right, from a perspective of that. And while people look at the language that he uses, what he says, which really at many times really cross lines of that shouldn't be crossed, they still they enjoy the entertainment of it all right? And the embodiment of this issue of a hero. And what, as I said earlier, when he was arrested, that only makes this hero stronger from a perspective of seen as a fighter. And you know, traditionally in Malay politics, the issue of fighting and struggle is very pertinent into the way the Malay politics has actually had a historical grounding. So, you know, UMNO was fighting the struggle for Malays. And you had people who were fighting, like Ahmad Said in Terengganu, he was trying to be a fighter, right? But what's happened is that PAS has actually effectively been able to embrace that, to co-opt that, and to transform it through someone like Sanusi.
Pakatan Harapan kind of zoomed in on Kedah as a key state, a key battleground. Anwar Ibrahim is spending his last day of campaigning there. I think he's going to have a big grand finale ceramah there to win over, you know, Malay voters who may be on the fence. What's your sense of how PH is making inroads in Kedah, and why is this so important in terms of gauging Malay support for the current unity government?
So Kedah is different than Kelantan and Terengganu because it has around a quarter, not quite, but almost a quarter of the population that are non-Malays. So it's a different ethnic configuration, and ethnicized voting still is quite significant through this election as it was in GE15. So because of that, these seats become more competitive. Right? At the same time, you know, Kedah is a place that has embraced different governments, so people are willing to make and have turnover. And so in this regard, the Perikatan Nasional, you know, potentially look like it might have been more vulnerable, or at least the gains, there'd be more competition. And so UMNO and Pakatan Harapan worked closely together in the campaign. They had this campaign, Ini Kali Sama, in this context, which I think didn't really make much sense. But the fact is that it had a situation where they began to mobilize very early on. Anwar government faces the challenge of what has been seen as a Malay deficit of political support. And by going to Kedah and by going after someone who is very antithetical to the leadership of Anwar Ibrahim. Anwar Ibrahim is a leadership that is based on intellectualism, based on a different type of discourse, right? Compared to Sanusi. While he has his own charisma, it has different types of roots. And I think there was a sense of wanting to basically go there to show that there would be a different way and a different path. And I think the challenge for Pakatan Harapan and for UMNO has been that their campaign hasn't had focus from a perspective of the issue areas. I mean, this is where I was mentioning earlier. Perikatan Nasional has this kind of, they have the greater Kedah, while, you know, Ini Kali Sama, I mean, what is Sama? What's the same exactly? And especially when you have discontent and you want the Sama, people don't like that.
Exactly.
You know, in that situation,
maybe they don't want the same old, right?
Yeah, they want something different. And Kedah is a place with a lot of people the society is changing, the demographics are changing, a lot of younger voters. It's full of a lot of dynamism. Yes, there's still challenges. They have lower education levels. There's higher levels of poverty, as we see, for example, also in places like Kelantan. But at the same juncture, there's also intensive dreams of a different reality, right? And the Kedah government, while it hasn't performed as well as other past governments, such as that of Terengganu, it has actually been able to capitalize on these emotions more effectively.
Okay, very interesting. So what is your prediction for the state, if I may ask?
I think Sanusi will win handily, and I think the opposite. Think Pakatan Harapan and UMNO will struggle to get a third of the seats.
And what would that tell you if they do struggle to get a third of the seats? What would that speak of in terms of the deficit of Malay support that you brought up earlier?
I think the leaders in Kedah need to be rejuvenated. All right, and I think that also there need to be a bit more strategic campaign choices from a perspective of areas. And also, I think that by putting a lot of attention to Kedah, it's backfired.
Okay, all right, we're going to take another very quick break and consider this. After the break, we'll come back and take a look at what's happening in Penang. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. I'm chatting tonight to Dr. Bridget Welsh. It's the eve of polling day and we're doing a comprehensive wrap-up of the last 14 days of campaigning and what we need to watch out for as we watch people go to the ballots, and we'll find out the results of the six state elections. Let's focus in on Penang, Bridget. You have earmarked N12 Penanti Pematang Power as one to watch in Penang, as a seat to watch. You cited it as a test of both the green wave and of Anwar's popularity as Prime Minister. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. Can you elaborate as to why this seat is emblematic of the green wave?
So in GE15, this seat was lost by Nurliza Anwar, by Pakatan Nationals fielding an Ustaz. And we saw real shifts in Malay voters, but also younger voters in this place. And of the three state seats in Pematang Pau, Penanti was where there was the most shift. So what's happened this time is that PKR has fielded an Ustaz. Ustaz, who was a previous candidate for PAS, and not in this seat, but in the seat slightly north, Penaga. And we see a situation where they're in what I call, if you can't beat them, to join them type of strategy. But I would, in fairness to the candidate Rashidi Hussain, that we see he has a different type of discourse than the other some others. But we see as a situation where it is a test of how people respond on issues of religion. And so one of the things about Kedah just now is that, why Kedah is so interesting is because PAS has gained its foothold through a lot of the religious schools. And to understand the support, it's not just about campaigns, it's also about the social networks where people are and live. And so what will determine a lot of Kedah outcome is when students come back that are outside of Kedah to come back to the madrasah areas that they might still vote in, as well as workers, young people who work outside, that will also make a difference. In a place like Penanti, a lot of people still live there, right? Because as opposed, there's not as many outside voters. And we'll see whether or not, this issue of how religion plays, right? And one of the things that's featured about Anwar's government is that he is constantly showing himself to be a very pious Muslim in his pictures and others, and he is in that context. So what we see is a situation where this is an aim to appeal and to show PKR and the government's credentials in terms of religious credentials.
Okay, so with the green wave that's been, characterized as rising religious conservatism, rising Islamization, is that too simplistic a way to characterize how it might be viewed in the Kedah state elections, Penang, particularly in the Seberang side, in the mainland side of Penang? Is that how we should be thinking about this so-called green wave as we watch maybe the results come in?
So in fairness, the green wave is substantive. So we do see a situation where rising conservatism, the appeals to religion are shaping voting patterns. No question, right? Okay. We see a large number of ustas being fielded. We see a large number, the issues and discourse about religion and interpretations of the faith do underscore some of the emotional dimensions and even rational dimensions of different campaigns. So we see some people not liking this candidate because they belong to this Islamic NGO versus others, right? So these issues are substantive. But I would also caution to say that the green wave is being overinterpreted. So therefore, in a place like Penanti, it's very relevant because you can see it's almost couched to the young voters and the Islamization and the use of istas. But at other places, young voters don't talk about religion. They talk about economy and job opportunities, and they talk about the ideas of stability or wanting things to just be normal, right? As opposed to, a lot of Malaysians are fed up with these elections, right? And this election definitely is a little bit cooler than other times, right? In that context. So, and what does this means? And this goes to other social forces taking place about how people engage on social media, how people think about the economy, the expectations for government, right? Before people would just accept and follow, right? And people's politics were from birth to death and following different political parties. Now people are looking to different parties very as turnover, and with that potentially comes opportunities, right? So okay, maybe if I join this one, I'll find some new job or some new economic links, and this has nothing to do with the green wave. It's about strategic economic interests or about social networks or about how they're triggered on TikTok by particular sets of messages. They may like that person as a footballer. They may like that person as a ustaz. They may like that person as an intellectual and discussing economic policies. So I think, we have to be cautious not to see this as just this kind of green wave. And in fact, the other problem is that the green wave is also used as a way to kind of push ethnic politics in a particular way, right? As in, there is a certain degree of Islamophobia in the way that people talk about the green wave. And one has to recognize that the discourse there's lots of debates. This doesn't mean that there aren't real concerns about Islamization and the rights of other communities. But the fact is that there are many different threads of why people are voting in different places. And the green wave is only part of the story.
Okay. Just very quickly, while we are still in Penanti, in Pematang Power, I'm curious to know about the Anwar Ibrahim factor there, because you can't think of Pematang Power without thinking of Anwar Ibrahim. And the loss of Nurul Izzah, the loss of that seat by Nurul Izzah in GE15 came as quite a shock to many people. How do you think this might play for Anwar Ibrahim if he doesn't win back this seat for Pakatan Harapan Barisan Nasional?
It wasn't a shock to me that she lost, because based on the simulations, the numbers were going in the direction of Pakatan Nasional. But I would say that, and the candidate in Penanti for PKR has a big road he has to cover. He has to win over 4,000 voters in a small constituency, which is about almost 25% of the constituency. It's not small, and I mean it's a large number of voters. So what I would say is that yes, it would be a loss for Anwar Ibrahim if he doesn't win a Penanti. But I also think that, part of the changes that are taking place in Malaysia is that there are no more legacy seats. The seats that people always have for the rest of their life.
And that's a good thing, right?
Good and bad, right? Because, it depends on if you're part of the legacy or not, right? And depends on how your political perspectives are. But I would say that, this idea that this is my seat or this party's seat, in democratic systems, no, wait a minute, you can be kicked out.
This is all part of what you were saying as expanding our democratic space, learning to find our democratic legs. So this is part of the school of hard knocks, so to speak.
And it's school of hard knocks, but it's also, it's disconcerting for many people, right? I think that, let's keep in mind that the experience that Malaysia's had to go through for the last 5 years politically has been a lot of shocks. And of course, Malaysians have weathered it wonderfully well. But the fact is that it's the politicians, maybe not so much. They continue to use these kind of narratives of the past and others. And I think that, this is the challenge, right? Is that parties assume that people will vote like they did in the past all the time, when in fact, maybe that's not always the case anymore.
20 seats out of 40 is what Perikatan Nasional is aiming for in Penang. Do you think that they might be able to get that, given that we're also seeing some leadership tensions among DAP Penang that's playing out very publicly during this campaign period?
To answer the question on Perikatan Nasional, no, I don't think they're going to get
20
that.
is too optimistic.
Yeah, and of course, you know, Perikatan Nasional has been very, I think, strategic in trying to project itself as the winner and hoping that people will join what they think are the winner in that context and to kind of create a movement in their campaign strategy. I think they will make gains, especially in the northern part and the mainland part of Penang. There are quite a few seats that are still touch and go in Penang, in the sense of seats like on the island, like Teluk Bahang for UMNO, right? Even on the northern part, like Bertam, where Rizal Merican is contesting, the former minister. So we see, you know, very fierce competitive fights. But I would say that, you know, the DAP's struggle has been open, right? And I think that, you know, I don't think that will affect their performance massively. I think we will see some changes in majorities. We'll see some shifts in small numbers of different communities of voters, but I don't think it will affect the outcome of the seats because I think they have a long way to go before they lose some of those seats. But I think that in terms of the contest is really in the Malay areas, so involving PKR, involving Amana, and of course Perikatan Nasional.
Okay, another very quick break here and Consider This. Still so much to cover. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to this special 1-hour edition of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, talking tonight to political commentator Dr. Bridget Welsh. Let's move over to Kelantan. I think it's quite interesting because in Kelantan, you've earmarked Gua Musang as an interesting place to watch, but you say it is key to watch because it will be a test of whether or not UMNO will have a future as a political force in Kelantan. Tell me a little bit about what you see there for UMNO.
So Gua Musang has always been their political base, right? Yeah, Tunku
Like
Razali held it, and then
another legacy seat,
another legacy seat, which he lost, right, in the GE15. Although that's still under petition, I understand. But I would say that in that particular seat, we had 3 state seats, all of which are very competitive. It was only in Galas, which is really in the heart of near the town of Gua Musang, where we will see a situation where the UMNO candidate has the best chance, and it's only there where UMNO still maintain a majority in GE15. And so we're going to see whether or not there is going to be another wave, additional wave for Perikatan Nasional, which would basically change a seat like Galas. The other seat that I looked at in Kelantan is Kota Lama, which is in the center of Kota Baharu. There are some rumblings involving the leadership struggle that's taking place within PAS. And one of the points I make about politics in Kelantan is that it's similar to what was in Johor earlier in the heyday days of UMNO, where it was always about competition within UMNO. Now it's always about competition within PAS. But I don't think, like the problems in DAP and Penang, those problems will affect PAS performance in seats. It's really things that will happen after, in terms of personality, the choices of who are the leaders, and so forth. So I look at Kelantan, and the words I used in my podcast to describe what I heard so many from voters in Kelantan is they have no choices. They have no choice. So there is a lot of residual sense of wanting to have a very different type of government. Keep in mind that the PASAN government in Kelantan has been there for 33 years. So the opposition, however, has not been strong enough to galvanize. And that question becomes why? Well, partly because the machinery at the state level is so deeply embedded into the social networks in Kelantan. And so we tend to see lower voter turnout. A lot of people that don't know, they don't turn out because they feel that the option to actually take over or to have alternative voices. in places like Galas and also the other seats, Nenggiri and Palo, these two seats will become, these three seats will become a situation where we'll see whether or not UMNO can hold on in this regard. And the numbers and the way that I see from the surveys, it's a tough fight for UMNO in Kelantan, and it's a tough fight for UMNO in Terengganu as well.
Tough fight for UMNO everywhere, would you say?
Yes, tough fight for UMNO, except it's a little less tough, a little sweeter for them in Negeri Sembilan.
Okay, tell me why. Because Negeri Sembilan is fascinating to me because of its uniqueness in the way it's handled political change, and because of its adat, because of its clan, its family, its the history of the political relationships there. Talk to me about why UMNO has a slight advantage in Negeri Sembilan.
So as you rightly point out, Negeri Sembilan has a different social structure, and you have the history of adat berpati, you have the suku clans, and you have a relationship between adat structures and UMNO that has been long-standing from a perspective of protecting and maintaining those networks and feeding into those social networks. And understanding elections is to understand the societies in different places and so there is a resistance to the change, particularly to the resistance of PAS coming in. So what's interesting is that in Negeri Sembilan, the battle is being led by Bersatu. And so right now, my projection is that the state government of Pakatan Harapan and UMNO should retain, and UMNO should perform reasonably, get the most seats out of all the seats that it's contesting in Negeri Sembilan. But there's still about 8 seats that I would say are very close. Some of those are UMNO seats, but many of those are also, some of them are Pakatan Harapan seats, such as Ampangan, for example. So the social structure and UMNO's base, and also I would say to a certain degree also UMNO's leadership. It doesn't face the same leadership problems, although there's some fragmentation and some infighting that help to explain what's happening in Negeri Sembilan. What is interesting is that a lot of the small seats like Gemas, Bagan Pinang, these seats are being structured by the military and vote that actually can influence the outcome. And so the border areas of Negeri Sembilan are very competitive, like Lenggeng or even places like Kemencha and Gemas, which are very close to other states, and that makes it interesting because there are outside influences. It's very dynamic.
Okay, just still while we're on the topic of UMNO, I'm curious to know where you see UMNO's strengths or its longevity even post these 6 state elections. Is UMNO going to be a minority party now in the future?
So many months ago, I wrote an article called The Golkarization of UMNO. And so where UMNO had become a second party in a government, as opposed to a party that was in the primacy and the dominant position. And in fact, it would actually, like Golkar, have regional support as opposed to national support. And what we're seeing this time is whether or not they actually maintain themselves as a national party. This election really touches on UMNO's future as a national party. If they lose badly in Kedah, in Terengganu, in Kelantan, you can see that it basically puts their base now into the south, places like Malacca, Johor, and Negeri Sembilan. Also, whether or not they hold on, how many seats they win in a place like Selangor and Penang, will also determine this trend. And they are now very much a secondary party, an important party, nevertheless, in a coalition system that Malaysia has. But at the same juncture, it is not as strong as it used to be. And then the question becomes about the leadership and this test for the leadership. Now, the Deputy Prime Minister, Zahid Hamidi, still controls the party at a very strong level. But one has to recognize that if UMNO does badly, that this would also be a second reflection on him at a campaign, that he is supposed to have been at the leadership of the party. And while he still controls a lot of the division chiefs, there will be a reckoning. There is a lot of resentment and infighting. And so how the infighting has been handled has also affected the base. So the question, people have left UMNO, but because of the nature of politics in Malaysia, where there is turnover, there's always the possibility that people might come back. But the circumstances have to change in the party for them to come back. And we see that very much, for example, in Malacca, right? In the Malacca state election, they came back, right, after when things weren't working. So I think that UMNO, I don't believe it'll be wiped out in this election, but I think it will face a very serious rebuke, and that's a second set of rebukes. And after many rebukes, because keep in mind, UMNO's political support has been declining since 2008 in this context. And, many people just are not comfortable voting for it, especially younger voters.
Okay. When we look at the different states that are going up for election, it seems to be that it's status quo in terms of 3 for Perikatan Nasional, 3 for Pakatan and Barisan Nasional. Do you think, though, that the leadership of these states might be affected, even though the administration, the political party governing it might not? But do you think that the Menteri Besars and the chief ministers might be affected?
So the only states that I'm looking at the Menteri Besars changing, that potentially we have the leadership struggle that's happening in PAS in Kelantan. We don't know what's going to happen there. I think those are issues that are playing out. And the configuration of voting seats may impact Negeri Sembilan. So in particular, even the Menteri Besar seat of Sekamat is also a very competitive seat. So I think those questions in Negeri Sembilan are on the table. But what is going to change about the leadership structure in all the states is that we're going to see a different configuration of different leaders that win seats among different parties. Okay. And we have a lot of new faces that are coming in. So it may not be at the Menteri Besar level, but you are going to have at the secondary and the exco level. And that's part of the turnover that's taking place. And I think we will see a kind of new governments in these places. Whether or not in Kedah, some people talk about Sanusi not being chosen again. But I think if all indications are if he performs as well as he has done, or from the polls are indicating, then I think that it is very much an affirmation of his leadership.
What about Selangor? Is Amiruddin Syari in a safe position? Is his state in a safe position?
Selangor is in a safe position from the perspective of the numbers. I don't think Perikatan Nasional will have enough seats to take over the government. I think they will make gains. And there are still quite a considerable seats that are competitive, including a seat like Ulu Klang, where former Menteri Besar Azman Ali is contesting. But I do think that there are a situation where the Amiruddin has been said that Anwar has said that he will be the chief minister, and I think that so far it looks like that. Their campaign has been around him, and the state government is popular, and so I think that popularity will extend. Obviously there could be a last-minute emotional swing in voting patterns, but I do think Amiruddin is most likely to stay in Selangor, but with different team.
So can we talk about voting patterns? Because I think you have done so much, data crunching from the GE15 data that you've been able to kind of break down voting patterns beyond ethnic voting patterns. But you also said a little bit earlier that people aren't voting the same way anymore, that the ways that people think about what impacts their ballot or their vote is changing. So how has that changed, just based on what you know from GE15 historical voting pattern data versus your chats to people on the ground, what they're concerned about, what they're thinking about, whether or not there's vote transferability, whether they might be thinking about switching parties? How do you make sense of these different competing narratives?
So you have to look at a whole series of things. You can't just look at one thing.
Okay.
You can't just say, oh, this is one racial community, therefore you're going to vote that way. That's not the case. It's usually a combination of class, gender, and ethnic type of dimensions, also where they're from, or what states and what choices that they have. Now, what's happened is, first of all, voters are getting their information very differently. You know, it used to be sometimes from the pengulus, sometimes from the charamas. You know, it used to be this kind of momentum. This campaign is, you know, the charamas have been relatively small.
Yes,
right? This
yes.
type, you know, where do people get their information? They get their information from their smartphone. They get their information from how they follow things online. And so the decision is not necessarily a group decision. It's more of an individual decision. So what we see is that wives and husbands may vote differently. Before, they used to vote the same, right? In that context, the family structure was important. And you still have the family saying, hey, to the young child, vote this way or that way. And sometimes you have the children saying to the parents, vote this way for this reason. Which, but family is important, especially for younger voters, and less informed and less engaged voters. But the nature of engagement has shifted in terms of how people make their decisions and this access to information. And so as a consequence, you need to look at these multiple sets of factors to understand how. And we see very interesting trends. You know, the undecided voters in this election were young people and women.
Women.
A lot of women are watching. Right? So, for example, I was struck in Terengganu by multiple conversations that I had with women in their 30s and all the way to their 50s who had traditionally voted for UMNO, that in GE15 voted for Kerajaan Nasional, but they were for PAS in the case of Terengganu, and they were considering whether or not they would go back to UMNO or not. Right? And in that context, and he says, well, I'm not yet decided in this way and that way. And they explained the reasons for it. And they said this is the issue of the candidate, or this is the issue of the party or the government. And so, you know, there's this perception, a misperception, that voters in the rural areas are uninformed, right? And that urban areas they're informed, when in fact there's misinformation everywhere. That's and there's misperception. And there's also this demonization, a very unfair demonization of places like Kelantan, Terengganu, and Kedah. Oh, these people are doing this and this way. And of course, it also reflects the emotions that those voters have when they demonize others, right? You know, Malaysia really wrestles with this politics of the other and the capitalization on the other. And this is a real challenge. But in this way, the state election is an interesting juxtaposition. While we have ethnicized votings, we also have conversations about policies. Now, only some places did that affect voters. But it still is the narratives, the discourse is changing as we normalize a kind of more complicated democratic process.
Okay, all right, Bridget, in the time that we have left, I'm curious to know what you will be watching for in the from, you know, tomorrow polling day until polls close, the results are announced. What will you be really kind of paying attention to that will impact the results, and moving forward post PRM, post state elections, that will impact Malaysia?
Number one, turnout, turnout. If you can go to the polls, vote. Every vote will count. Turnout will make an impact. And it's not just turnout of overall, but also for turnout of core supporters, the campaigns that have been able to mobilize in that context. Number two, we're looking at the pattern in the hot seats, the too close to call seats, because that will determine whether or not there is that bigger swing in terms of per capita national gains, as well as the fortunes of particular parties such as UMNO, but also AWANI faces a lot of very serious competition in this election in that context. So we have other parties that are very much facing significant battles. I will also look at the issue and the contests for people for leadership positions and how those battles are. Places like Sekamat, places like Ulu Klang, right? Because that will also affect the caliber of who's being elected. And keep in mind, you know, that it is about a competent government afterwards and about the nature of individuals who will be part of the mix, whoever comes. And, you know, I will also be doing focus groups with younger voters and some of these undecided voters to see how they made the final decision, to see how they swung in different ways.
You must keep us posted on that. Bridget, thank you so much for speaking with me. I appreciate your time and you sharing your insights and observations for traveling around on the campaign trail. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for inviting me.
That's all we have for you on this special 1-hour episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. reminding you not to forget to vote tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.